this country is at war with Germany.
We shall go on to the end.
I remember the sheets of flame which came up and almost blinded us from our guns.
Hello and welcome to another episode of the World War II podcast. I'm Angus Wallace. In this episode of the podcast, we're going to shine a light on the naval conflict in the Mediterranean and the Middle East. This proved to be a prolonged conflict waged at differing times against the combined forces of Italy, Germany and Vichy France, over a wide area stretching from the coastal waters of southern Europe in the north to Madagascar in the south and Africa's Atlantic coast in the west to the Persian Gulf in the east. Utilising a variety of weapons, including surface warships, submarines and aircraft, along with sizable merchant fleets, the British and their subsequent American partners would maintain vital seaborne lines of communication, conducting numerous amphibious landings, interdicting Axis supply activities, and eventually eliminating all semblances of Axis maritime power within the theatre. I'm joined by Brian Walter. If you recall, Brian joined me in episode 127 to discuss the Battle of the Atlantic. Brian has a new book out, Blue Water War, The Maritime Struggle in the Mediterranean. Now, this podcast is brought to you with the kind contribution of fellow listeners. If you think there is a vast machine at work in the background with assistants, researchers and audio engineers all beavering away, paid for by a philanthropic millionaire, you will be wrong. It's just me. But I could use your help. All that costs me. It's not just my time. Software and research material is an ongoing cost. If each one of you tossed a shekel in my virtual tip jar at patreon.com/WW2podcast, I would have a pretty good monthly salary, but I appreciate not everyone has the luxury of spare change. But if you do enjoy the show every couple of weeks, why not go to patreon.com/WW2podcast and become a patron of the show? Brian, welcome back. It's nice to see you again. I thought we might start with the forces of the belligerent navies in the Mediterranean. Clearly, for the Italians, this is their home waters. But how do both sides shape up?
Well, that's a great question. And the truth of the matter is the British definitely start out numerically at disadvantaged in the Mediterranean area. That's true of all the British services. Now, I know people have kind of pushed back at me and they said, yeah, the Royal Navy, though, was much stronger than the Italian Navy was overall. And that's a true statement. But the Royal Navy had global commitments and was spread out, and particularly had a commitment to defend Britain, both indirectly with the Atlantic convoy routes and directly against a potential invasion. So the point of this is the British can only utilize a portion of their forces in the Mediterranean, whereas the Italians are free to pretty much use all of their forces. And the result is that at the beginning of this conflict, the British are heavily outnumbered. And just to give you an idea in terms of the naval situation, at the beginning of this conflict, the Italians have about 270 principal warships on hand or about to enter service. This includes 6 battleships, 1 old armored cruiser, 7 heavy cruisers, 12 light cruisers, 61 destroyers, 69 torpedo boats, and 115 submarines. Just real quick, I mentioned these torpedo boats. I like to specify what a torpedo boat is because a lot of people confuse a torpedo boat with a motor torpedo boat or a PT boat. And that's not what these are in this classification of warship. What these are essentially small destroyers. So when you hear me talk about torpedo boats, what I'm actually referring to are small destroyers. So about 270 Italian vessels that are on hand are about to enter service. The British Mediterranean fleet at the same time consists of 41 principal warships. That includes 4 battleships, 1 aircraft carrier, 9 light cruisers, 21 destroyers, and 6 submarines. So the British are outnumbered by a factor of about 6 to 1. And you know, some people have pushed back and they said, yes, but not all of these Italian vessels were immediately ready for service. And I said, okay, I'll grant you that. So maybe they're only outnumbered by 4 to 1, or worst case scenario, or best case scenario, I guess, from a British point of view, is they're outnumbered 3 to 1, but they're still substantially outnumbered. The situation's much the same with the Army. The Italians have a nominal force of about 1.6 million men in their Army, spread across 73 divisions. They have a further 300,000 men in black shirt militia units. The total number of Italian forces that are actually present in Libya and Italian East Africa amount to about 540,000 men. Against this, the British have within the region 83,000 men. So the British Army is outnumbered again by a factor of about 6 to 1. And as far as the Air Force is concerned, they're probably in the best shape. The Italians have about 1,700 frontline aircraft at the beginning of this conflict, of which about 638 are in the contested area. The Italians have 338 aircraft in Africa. The British have 368. So in this case, the Italians only outnumber the British by a factor of about 2 to 1. So each of the services starts out outnumbered. And the other thing you have to keep in mind is it's questionable at the beginning of this contest to what degree the United Kingdom is going to be able to send supplies in order to help relieve the situation. And or if they do send supplies, it's understood it's going to be a while before any type of meaningful reinforcements arrive in the area. So the local commands understand that at least initially they're pretty much on their own and they're going to have to make do with what they have. So again, they're going to be on the defensive, but they're going to exercise a very aggressive defense.
What's very notable from those figures is how many submarines the Italians have, which must be something to do with the interwar naval agreements that they presumably they have so many. But that must put them in an excellent position on paper to interdict any logistic support that the British are trying to push through to North Africa.
You would think that would be the case, but actually the Italian submarine force, given its size, which makes up about 45% of the Italian combat forces, something in that realm, it actually underperforms. And this becomes very obvious in the first month of the war. And literally in a period of about 3 weeks, the Italians will begin submarine operations against the British. They will sink a handful of British ships, including a cruiser, a light cruiser, a destroyer, and a sloop. And they also sink 3 merchant ships, so a total of 6 vessels altogether. But they will lose 10 submarines in the process of that period. So it's an exchange rate of almost 2 submarines, Italian submarines, that are sunk for every British loss. And that's an unsustainable exchange rate. The Italians will never really recover from this poor start that they have, because for the remainder of the war, I think they will somewhat reduce their operational tempo, and their submarines will not ever really be able to be that major of a factor. I mean, literally for the remainder of the Mediterranean contest, Italian submarines will only sink a handful of additional British vessels, and in return, they will continue to suffer a fairly large stream of attrition, amounting to another 54 Italian submarines that are sunk during this contest. And as a result of this, this substantial portion of the Italian Navy, which you would think would have a much more impact upon these naval operations in the Mediterranean, to a very large extent proves to be kind of a non-factor. To
follow that along that theme of logistical support, did the navies plan for how they might support their colonies? Because you've got the Italians in North Africa and they're in East Africa. You've got the British in North Africa. The British are also in East Africa. Whilst this is a naval campaign, a large portion of this is involved with actually logistics and ensuring logistical routes. So I mean, how are they planning on? And I presume that is absolutely central to much of this campaign is logistics.
Really when it boils down to this, probably somewhere in the realm of 95 to 98% of all maritime operations that are involved in this campaign in the Mediterranean and surrounding waters, directly or indirectly deals with this logistical contest. You're either logistically trying to support your own forces, or you're trying to impede the other guy from logistically supporting his. So basically, just about everything that happens in the maritime realm, one way or another, ties into this logistical contest. And logistics is king. And I'm sure we're going to be touching upon logistics throughout this conversation, but there's 3 major components I want to talk about now to kind of answer your question that will really dominate the first half of this maritime contest in the Mediterranean. First of these is, how do the British logistically support their forces in the Middle East? Italy is, of course, located in the central Mediterranean, and as such is the dominant power there. And the British immediately realize that it's impractical to try and sail convoys through the central Mediterranean. Now, in fact, they will a couple of times do convoys through the Mediterranean, but those are like one-off exercises that are remarkably successful. But the bulk of the material and the reinforcements that the British are going to provide to the Middle East can't go through the central Mediterranean. So there's only one potential route that they can use, and that is to basically circumnavigate the continent of Africa. and send their convoys around the Cape of Good Hope and the Horn of Africa. This adds about 8,500 miles onto each convoy passage for a total distance of about 11,600 miles, basically from London to Cairo. So it's a very long and arduous route. And quite frankly, Britain is about the only major power at this time in the world that could have carried off such an undertaking. The United States probably could have done this too. But, none of the other major powers had the maritime assets to be able to carry out something like this. But the British have the largest merchant fleet in the world, which in June 1940, at the start of this conflict, consists of over 20 million tons of shipping. They also have a global infrastructure in place that will allow them to do this. And again, they have the Royal Navy. So they have the means to carry out this logistical operation. Now, against this, there is one other potential threat that could derail this whole activity, and that is as you're closing in to the Egypt, you have to pass your ships through the Red Sea. And that is a classic choke point. And what is right there in that area is Italian East Africa. And the Italians do maintain a naval base at Massawa in Eritrea. They have a small squadron there that consists of 7 destroyers, 2 torpedo boats, 8 submarines, a handful of motor torpedo boats. And then they also have about 325 aircraft in Italian East Africa. So if the Italians are able to operate, competently, they should be able to seriously impede or even shut down this traffic as it's passing through this bottleneck. Fortunately for the British, they're able to generally neutralize this Italian threat relatively quickly, and then they will eliminate it altogether in 1941, as I imagine we'll probably discuss later on. Taking this potential bottleneck out of the picture, this is a long and arduous route, but it also proves to be very safe for the ships involved. And just to give you an idea of some of the traffic that will pass through here, now we're advancing a couple years into the conflict, but in the first 8 months of 1942, through this route, the British will transport 192,000 men, 581 tanks, 1,700 guns, 13,000 vehicles, and almost 250,000 tons of supplies to their forces in the Middle East via this route. And in the process of doing this, they will only lose a single merchant ship. So again, this is a very successful undertaking for them, but it's a substantial effort that they have to put forth in order to execute this. Now, for the Italians, they would seemingly have a much easier task to perform. Now, first of all, they have their forces in Italian East Africa. Those forces are cut off, and they don't have a means to logistically support them through maritime lines of communication. So the Italians are going to have to act relatively promptly in order to provide, land bridges to this area if they want to logistically support them. But they do have, a fairly substantial stores built up there that will allow Italian East Africa to function for a while. So they're not really focused on Italian East Africa, but they also have substantial forces in Libya. And the task of supporting them would seem relatively simple because you literally have to sail your merchant ships a few hundred miles across the Mediterranean. Here the British are sailing ships, 11,000 miles, and the Italians have to cross a few hundred miles. But there are a number of potential problems that could interdict this, and 2 of the main ones I'm going to comment on now. First of all is the poor state of the Italian merchant fleet, which at the beginning of this conflict, the Italian merchant navy has about 3.3 million tons of merchant shipping. At the very beginning of this conflict, about 1/3 of this, about 1.2 million tons of this merchant shipping is either caught in British-controlled areas or is caught outside of the Mediterranean. The British will immediately seize or sink a number of these vessels amounting to about 200,000 tons. The vast bulk of the remainder, about 1 million tons worth, that is outside of the Mediterranean. Some of these vessels will take refuge in Italian East Africa. Some will take refuge in German-controlled French Atlantic ports. But most will end up settling into neutral ports in the Americas and Asia. So at the very beginning of this contest, the Italians already lose a third of their merchant fleet, which kind of puts them at a disadvantage. And to add insult to injury, ultimately, most of these displaced Italian vessels that are either in Italian East Africa or have taken refuge in the Americas will eventually fall under Allied service because they'll be seized by the British when they conquer Italian East Africa in 1941, or when the United States and other Latin American countries come into the war, they'll be seized by those authorities. So that's, a major defeat for the Italians at the very beginning of this contest in terms of it. They essentially lose a third of their active merchant fleet. The second potential factor that can complicate their supply operations is Malta, which is this small little island group that's located in the central Mediterranean that's under British control. It's this little enclave of British power in an area that's otherwise dominated by the Italians. Now, at the beginning of this conflict, Malta is practically defenseless, and it has no offensive capabilities whatsoever. But it has the potential, if the British can reinforce it and sustain it, and it's ideally positioned to be able to directly menace these Italian merchant ships and convoys that are traveling across the Mediterranean to support their activities in Libya. So in that regard, Malta presents itself as both a opportunity for the British, but it's also a burden. Because in order to build up and sustain Malta, unlike the bulk of the British forces in the Mediterranean that can be supported by this route around Africa, if you're going to build up and sustain Malta, you have to directly sail convoys into the central Mediterranean. So those will be two competing components of this convoy logistical operation that will be going on. The British trying to use Malta to logistically impede Italian, merchant shipping traveling into Libya, while the British are sailing convoys into the central Mediterranean to support and reinforce Malta. And these three factors, the convoys around Africa, the Italian efforts to support their forces in Libya, and British efforts to impede that, and then British efforts to maintain Malta and Axis efforts to impede those, will really be the dominant, factors that will be the case for the next 2.5 years of the Mediterranean contest.
Right from the start, the British seem extremely aggressive in the Mediterranean. Do you think that shows a confidence that they know that their logistics might be long, but they're going to work? Because Cunningham comes out pretty quick, doesn't he? Swinging.
Yeah, the British definitely plan to exercise an aggressive defense, and they want to, and they plan to take the offensive anywhere that they can. Now, obviously, we're talking on a limited basis, but they definitely come out aggressively, and quite frankly, part of this is based upon a confidence that they have in themselves, but also part of this is based upon a contempt that they have for the Italians. And again, maybe you don't want to use this word, but I mean, that's kind of reflecting some of the attitudes that existed at the time. So you're absolutely correct. I mean, within the first hours of the war being declared, Cunningham sorties the Mediterranean fleet out in search of Italian vessels, does an offensive sweep. He also dispatches cruisers and destroyers to bombard Tobruk. Now, at the end of the day, the bombardment of Tobruk goes fine. The sweep itself isn't quite as successful. They don't find any Italian ships, and on their way back, one of their cruisers, the Calypso, is torpedoed by an Italian submarine that we mentioned earlier and is sunk. So it's kind of an inauspicious start for these operations, but it's kind of also an exception to what will follow, because Cunningham and the British will continue to be offensive in their attitudes. They will continue to carry out bombardments of Italian positions, and they will seek out the Italians to engage them where they can. And over the next 4 to 5 months, the Royal Navy will fight a number of minor engagements against the Italians where they are successful at Zante, at Cape Spada, at Cape Passero, and in the Red Sea. They'll have collective actions that will result in the destruction of an Italian light cruiser, 3 destroyers, and two torpedo boats. Now, in addition to this, the Fleet Air Arm, which only operates a relative handful of aircraft at this time, literally there's probably no more than a couple dozen Fleet Air Arm Swordfish torpedo bombers that are present in the Mediterranean at any given time during this period. But they'll be able to carry out a series of effective attacks against the Italians, a couple times against Tobruk, once in the Bay of Bamba, and then once in Benghazi, where again, collectively, they'll sink 5 destroyers, 1 submarine, 1 depot ship, and 5 merchant ships. The point of these things is, again, these aren't overly concerning losses to the Italians given the size of their forces, but, they're pinprick victories that I like to use the term pinprick, where the British are inflicting a steady stream of attrition against the Italians, and they're doing this at minimal cost to themselves. And this is just an example to keep punching at the Italians and keep them off guard. Same thing will happen, on the ground, where for the first couple months of the campaign, the British will carry out very aggressive patrolling and raids against Italian positions along the Egyptian-Libyan border, and they'll be fairly successful. They'll end up, carrying out a number of these successful operations. They take about 800 prisoners, and they do it for minimal loss to themselves. The point of this, again, is to keep the Italians off balance and also convince the Italians that the British are stronger than what they actually are, and keep them frozen in place. And you'll have similar operations in the air, where the British will come out swinging far more aggressively than the Italians do in this regard. Now, for their self, the Italians, who are the initiators of the contest, really don't, and again, who have these numerical advantages, and are in a situation where, for a variety of different reasons, I mentioned Italian East Africa, the Italians need to be successful quickly, because if the fighting becomes protracted, they're not in a position to be successful in a protracted war. So it behooves them to operate very significantly early on, but they don't. To a large extent, the Italian Navy really doesn't attain any real aggressive posture. They limit their aggressive actions to mine laying, bombing, and again, that submarine campaign that we talked about. By and large, those activities are fairly ineffective. So the Italians really kind of just sit on their hands to a degree and let this period of time that they have an opportunity to potentially be successful kind of slip away from them.
Well, I might have got my timeline slightly wrong. I was going to ask about Taranto. Because I found a reference, somebody describing it as the Pearl Harbor of the Mediterranean, and you mentioned the Fleet Air Arm. I wondered that attack on Taranto by. Well, do you want to tell us about the attack on Taranto? And is it hyperbole calling it, trying to describe it as the Pearl Harbor of the Mediterranean?
I think that it is somewhat hyperbole. Taranto is a big deal, but it's not as big a deal as some people like to think it is. Basically, what Taranto is a carrier airstrike against the Italian naval base at Taranto. It's called Operation Judgment is the actual operation. It is not a major operation in terms of the actual strike force that is employed. And again, this is kind of in keeping with what I was talking about before, when I was talking about the Fleet Air Arm strikes that occur earlier than this. I mean, in one of those strikes, the British attacked in July of 1944. They attacked Tobruk Harbor with a grand total of 6 Swordfish torpedo bombers. But those 6 torpedo bombers will sink 2 Italian destroyers and a merchant ship. So it's a very effective use and economy of force for the resources they have. And Taranto is kind of a reflection of this. The British will attack Taranto with 1 aircraft carrier, that is HMS Illustrious. They had intended to use 2, but at the last minute, the second carrier, Eagle, has to fall out because it has problems with its fuel handling system. So it's a single aircraft carrier, and the total strike force that the British are able to send against this anchorage is 21 Swordfish torpedo bombers. So to compare this to Pearl Harbor, again, is a bit of hyperbole, because the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor with 6 aircraft carriers and 350 strike aircraft, and this is 1 aircraft carrier with 21 strike aircraft. But in the fashion of the economy of force that I talked about, these 21 aircraft are still fairly successful in the fact that they're able to disable 3 Italian battleships during this strike. Of these 3 battleships, one of them, the Conti Cavere, is a total loss. I mean, it'll eventually be raised, but it'll never be fully repaired. So for all intents and purposes, it's a total loss. The other 2 will be out of action for 4 months and 7 months, respectively. So I know in some respects, people sometimes talk about how the British, took out half of the Italian fleet at Taranto. Well, actually what they did is they took out 1 Italian battleship and temporarily took out 2 more. But they did this with 21 aircraft. And it was an important success. Absolutely, but it's not as large as some people think it is. But the one thing I will say is it does kind of signal a turning point in this contest, where up until this point, the Italians still have the strategic initiative. Now, to a large extent, they're not exercising that initiative, but they have the strategic initiative. And Taranto, before this, of course, the British, again, are scoring these pinprick victories. But with Taranto, it definitely shows that the British have turned the tables now on the Italians and that the British are winning. A few weeks later, the British will launch Operation Compass in the Western Desert, where they'll take the offensive against the Italian 10th Army in Egypt. And in the course of 10 weeks, they'll utterly destroy that army and take about 130,000 prisoners. So these two things kind of bookend each other. The British have established themselves as they're winning now in the sea war, and they're winning now on land. And the strategic advantage is switched over to the British. And the Italians really aren't in a position now to be able to turn this around. Of course, what will end up turning this around is the Germans will intervene. And Germany becomes involved in the contest, and the fighting then will become much more difficult. But just left to their own devices, the British had gone from the situation where they're at a strategic disadvantage to very quickly turning this around. And if it left to their own devices, had this just been Italy and Britain, I think the whole thing would have probably been over by the middle of 1941.
Would this nail in the coffin for the Italian Navy from that point of view be Cape Matapan?
Cape Matapan is certainly an important surface engagement of the war. It's a substantial British victory. This takes place in March 1941 when the Italians sortie a force out to attempt to impede British convoy traffic going back and forth to Greece. The British Mediterranean Fleet is able to intercept the Italians and engage them in combat. The result is the British Mediterranean Fleet sinks 3 Italian heavy cruisers and 2 destroyers for no loss to themselves. So it is definitely one of the more substantial surface engagements of the Second World War. Is it decisive? That's a pretty strong word. I won't say it's decisive, but it's definitely a significant victory for the British. But it is decisive in this respect. As I kind of alluded to earlier, the British are going to challenge the Italians in the central Mediterranean. At the beginning of this war, Italy is the dominant power in the central Mediterranean. The British areas of power are the eastern Mediterranean and the western Mediterranean, out of Alexandria and Gibraltar. Now, the British are constantly trying to challenge Italian dominance in the central Mediterranean. And there will be examples after Matapan where British warships operating in the central Mediterranean will wipe out entire Axis convoys that are traveling to Libya. So they're constantly challenging the Italians in the central Mediterranean. By comparison, the Italians almost never attempt to challenge the British in either the eastern Mediterranean or the western Mediterranean. The sole exception to this is at the end of March 1941, when they do sortie out again to try and engage these convoys. They basically did this because they were urged to do so by the Germans. And this one and only time they go out on an offensive sortie into the eastern Mediterranean, it results in the Battle of Matapan, where they end up having this significant loss. They will never again try and attempt to challenge the British in the eastern Mediterranean or the western Mediterranean for that matter. And that will become important because a few months later, when the British are withdrawing their forces from Greece and Crete, and they're coming under great duress from the Luftwaffe, the Italian Navy sits on its hands and does not try to intervene. And again, I think a big part of that was because of the defeat they had suffered in Matapan. And so in that regard, I think it is decisive.
So you mentioned the Germans arriving in North Africa. I wondered how that changes things at sea, because Germany doesn't really have the largest surface fleet out aggressively patrolling. So can they add anything to the war at sea in the Mediterranean when it's quite significant their commitments to North Africa?
No, absolutely. Germany's intervention into the campaign in the Mediterranean area basically changes everything. It adds a whole different dimension into this conflict. And again, from the British point of view, they've demonstrated they can handle the Italians, but this adds a whole different level of difficulty to the enterprise. And it really be the Germans that will drive the rest of the contest. I mean, clearly the Italians still provide the bulk of the naval forces because you're right, the Germans will not maintain, at least during the first half of this up and through 1943. They don't have any sizable surface forces that exist in the Mediterranean. But what the Germans do provide to this contest is the Luftwaffe. And the Luftwaffe will become the Royal Navy's greatest nemesis in the Mediterranean contest. More British ships will be sunk by Luftwaffe bombers, certainly than the Italian Navy during the course of the Mediterranean campaign. And then a second factor that they also will bring in is eventually they will bring in U-boats, beginning in the fall of 1941. And these U-boats will also have an impact. They will prove to be more effective than their Italian counterparts in conducting submarine operations in the Mediterranean. And then, of course, the final element that they have is ground forces. which will bolster the Italians in the North Africa campaign. Of course, you have General Erwin Rommel, who theoretically actually is subordinate to, an overall Italian commander within the Libya, but basically he runs the show. And for the remainder of the fighting in North Africa, it'll be done not against an Italian force, but a collective German-Italian force, against the forces of Britain, eventually the British Eighth Army. So it's with these primary areas that the Germans make their impact felt. The Luftwaffe, later on the U-boats, and the ground forces that they dispatch to North Africa to engage the British.
Why are the U-boats more effective than the Italian ones? When the Italians clearly had a lot more of them. They presumably had the infrastructure to support them. But what are the Germans doing different with their U-boats that makes them more effective?
Generally, I think in terms of both the technology, the German U-boats tended to be better, and they were better handled. The Italians tended to build larger submarines. They were more ungainly. It would take 2 or 3 times longer for an Italian submarine to dive, for instance, than a typical German U-boat did. They lacked some of the higher end technology, and the Italians just didn't use their submarines as aggressively and in the same way that the Germans did. The Italians were generally intent on remaining submerged and letting traffic, come to them. And if something happened to pass by them, they might engage it. Where the Germans were much more involved in actively seeking out and trying to engage targets. Now, in fairness, I'll point out a couple of things. In fairness, the Italians do end up sending some of their submarines to operate in the Atlantic, operating out of the French Atlantic ports in conjunction with the Germans. And French submarines in the Battle of the Atlantic, Italian submarines in the Battle of the Atlantic will be much more effective than they are operating in the Mediterranean itself. They're still not as effective as the German U-boats are, but they do perform better in the Atlantic than they do in the Mediterranean. The flip side of it is the German U-boats, while they certainly perform better than the Italian submarines do in the Mediterranean is not necessarily an easy area for them to operate in either. But among other things, they're going to struggle to find targets to engage during much of this time, and they're not necessarily going to be as successful, at least in this part of the war, as they would have been in the Atlantic. Admiral Dornitz, the German commander, is not happy about having to dispatch his U-boats into the Mediterranean because he realizes that the real opportunity to go at the British is in the Atlantic, and he sees this as a diversion of his resources, which on a strategic level is probably true. The Italians do perform better in the Atlantic than they do in the Mediterranean. The Germans perform better in the Atlantic than they do in the Mediterranean. But overall, the Germans tend to perform better overall.
With the arrival as well with the Germans, there seems to be a renewed emphasis on Malta. Am I right in saying that? So, I mean, it becomes, the British losses are incredible. Trying to resupply Malta, it almost makes it's incredible that they decided to hold on. Is it central to that campaign? What is Malta giving to the Allies at that point with the Navy? I
think it would have been exceedingly difficult, particularly when you move into 1941, 1942. For the British to carry out an effective interdiction campaign against the Italian merchant traffic that is passing through the Mediterranean, to the Libyan ports without Malta as a base. I'm not saying there wouldn't have been any interdiction efforts, because I'm sure the British would have still continued to do what they could. I'm sure they would have still continued to dispatch submarines from Alexandria and Gibraltar into the central Mediterranean. But having Malta as a base definitely plays dividends to them. Now, a couple of things I'll just point out about Malta. Again, I mentioned this earlier. At the beginning of this contest, Malta is practically defenseless, and it has no offensive capabilities. It really doesn't generate itself into an offensive base until the beginning of 1941. So for the first 7 months of the war, Malta is really kind of a non-factor as far as this interdiction effort is concerned. But by 1941, it'll definitely become a key player in the interdiction activities. It's hard to quantify, what this means, but I think without Malta as a base, you're going to at least cut in half the amount of merchant tonnage that the British are able to sink in 1941 and 1942 and going into 1943. And that's probably a conservative estimate. this probably amounts to somewhere in the realm of about 1 million tons of Italian shipping that would have otherwise gotten through, that doesn't get through without the benefit of Malta as a base. It's really essential to the Allied interdiction efforts in trying to impede this traffic. When you look at the access logistical operations, one of the things that becomes very clear is you can see the ebb and flow of things. And when the British are doing a good job of interdicting the Italian supply traffic coming across the Mediterranean, British fortunes on the battlefield definitely tend to improve. And when the Germans are and the Axis are being more successful at bringing the resources across, the Axis tends to be more successful. And you can see this ebb and flow. Now, if you take Malta out of this picture, obviously it's going to be much easier for the Axis to prevail. And who knows, they might win in North Africa without Malta as that base. A final thing I'll just throw in here is you talked about the cost. I think it's really kind of interesting is that, as I said earlier in the conversation, in order to maintain Malta, the British have to send their supply operations directly into the central Mediterranean. That is obviously a challenging undertaking, but surprisingly, for most of this period, the British are actually very successful at doing this. In the first 2.5 years of the Mediterranean contest, the British will send 35 convoys major convoys to support Malta. The majority of these will arrive with no losses or minimal losses. So that is both a testament to the prowess of the British effort, but it's also, again, an indictment of the Italians and later the Germans and the fact that they didn't do a better job of really impeding these convoys. The sole exception to this is about an 8-month period, that is from February 1942 through August 1942, when things do become very difficult for these British convoys. And that's when you have some of these classic convoy battles. You have Operations Vigorous and Harpoon, and then later Operation Pedestal. It's during this difficult period, but not every one of these convoys is Operation Pedestal. That's the exception. The rule is most of the convoys before and after this get through either unscathed or with minimal losses. So the result of this all is that, yes, the British do suffer some heavy losses, but they're not as heavy as I think some people like to believe that they were. Losses in supporting Malta include 1 aircraft carrier, 4 cruisers, 11 destroyers, and 23 merchant ships. So that's the price they pay in return. Like I said, Malta, allows them to maybe sink 1 million tons of actual merchant shipping and be victorious in North Africa. So it's definitely a strain and it's definitely a cost, but I think it pays benefits at the end.
It's funny because the headline thing about Malta is that it is things like Pedestal, when you get 9 out of 14 merchantmen sank, so you just assume that every convoy to Malta was a disaster. But they're clearly the ones that get reported. The boring ones, all the boring ones that get through with no problems, are not interesting. So that's what's
not too many people have written books on those convoys. And one other thing I'll just throw out there about Malta, real quick, now that I'm thinking about it, is another thing you have to keep in mind, that if the British had lost control of Malta or given it up, assuming that they are still victorious in North Africa, if the British want to open the Mediterranean up for their own use as a transportation artery, or if they want to conduct further combat operations, into Southern Europe, they have to take Malta back. So you have to consider the cost that would have been when you're evaluating the cost of holding Malta. They almost certainly would have had to take Malta back, because I cannot see any scenario where the British can open up the central Mediterranean without control of Malta.
Is it for the end of 42? The Allies launched Torch. Now this is the Americans are now part of the show. I just wondered how much does the American U.S. Navy change the dynamic, because previously it has essentially been the Royal Navy on its own, or the Royal Navy of the Commonwealth on its own.
As you mentioned, in November 1942, the Allies launched Operation Torch, the invasion of North Africa. That really signals a turning point in a number of different ways. And it's kind of interesting because just a few months before this, in June 1942, British fortunes in the Mediterranean had been in a low ebb. I mean, it looked like the British might be driven out of Egypt and out of the Eastern Mediterranean. Malta looked like it was about to fall, and it's a very stark situation. Of course, through the Battle of First Alamein, the Pedestal convoy, and then the subsequent offensive of the Second Battle of El Alamein, the British are able to turn this thing around. And they win the victory at Second El Alamein at, opening days of November. And then a few days later, the Allies launch this major landing in French North Africa. And it really signals, an essential turning point in the whole campaign where, the Allies again had been on the defensive, and now clearly not only are they on the offensive, but they're definitely winning. And of course, this signals America's entrance, as a major partner now into the Mediterranean contest. Now, you mentioned the United States Navy. The United States Navy will be a partner in this fighting, but not as substantial a partner as you would think. They make up a fair amount of the forces that conduct the landings in North Africa. They will later provide part of the forces that are involved in the landings in Sicily. The Americans do provide the bulk of the naval forces during the landings in French, southern France. But when it comes to engaging again in the bulk of the operations, it's still primarily the Royal Navy that does the bulk of the fighting during this time frame for the remainder of the campaign. And so the American Navy, when it comes to the actual fighting, does not participate in that much of the actual fighting. Now, the force that does become a major player in the Mediterranean contest is the United States Army Air Force. And in the last 2 years of the war, the United States Army Air Force will sink large numbers of Italian and German vessels in this contest. So they will become much more of an actual player in the fighting that takes place in the Mediterranean than the United States Navy. Although, again, the United States Navy will provide assets to these different landing operations and will definitely be there, but they're not as big of a player in the actual combat as you would think they would have been.
Well, it's funny because I get the feeling the war in the Med there's much more of a synergy between all arms than perhaps sort of the war in the Atlantic or maybe not so much the war in the Pacific. It's slightly different again, but they're all sort of very much working together where the Navy is very closely associated with what's happening on the land and supplies, and at the same time aeroplanes are very effective because ultimately the Meds are slightly, it's quite a small body of water compared to the Pacific or the Atlantic. So you can see how the arrival of the US Air Force in numbers bolstering the British really helps turn the campaign, presumably.
Well, it was like I said earlier, the Luftwaffe, in fact, becomes Royal Navy's greatest nemesis. And I wouldn't necessarily say the United States Army Air Force becomes the Axis' greatest nemesis, but it just shows you the power that shore-based aircraft in a region like the Mediterranean can have in that type of campaign. And it's definitely, becomes a major player in the last 2 years of the contest.
So post Sicily, we get with the invasion of the Italian mainland, the Italians surrender. Is that essentially it for the naval conflict in the Mediterranean? Because presumably the only thing left is air power to threaten the navies.
I think it's well. Before we answer that question, I want to talk a little bit about the importance of the surrender of the Italian fleet. Because I think sometimes, again, people just kind of ho-hum. Okay, the Italian fleet surrenders. Well, Italy surrenders and the Italian fleet surrenders. But, materially, when you look at what happens, when Italy leaves the war, part of the armistice agreement that brings this about requires them to surrender their fleet to the Allies. A total of 108 Italian principal warships will come under Allied control as a result of this. This will include 5 battleships, 9 cruisers, 37 destroyers and/or torpedo boats, and 34 submarines. Now, in material terms, that's a fairly substantial force. And had those forces been, sunk in a naval battle, this would be one of the great naval battles in history. And just to put this in perspective, with the surrender of the Italian fleet, the Axis lose more principal warships than they do at 1st and 2nd Narvik, the Battle of Matapan, the Battle of Midway, all the naval fighting off of Guadalcanal, the Battle of the Marianas, and the Battle of Leyte Gulf combined. So in material terms, this is a pretty major deal. At a strategic level, of course, the naval alliance that had confronted the Allies, which consisted of three nations, is reduced now to 2. And the Italian Navy, which had been the 5th largest navy in the world at the time of the beginning of this conflict, of course, is eliminated from the Axis order of battle. So, I didn't want to just gloss over the surrender of the Italian fleet because I think, in material terms, it's a significant deal. Number two, I also want to talk real quickly about the demise of Italy and what that means to the Germans. When Italy leaves the war, at the time of Italy's demise, the Italians have about 2 million men under arms in their army. About 800,000 of these men are in Italy itself. A couple 100,000 are in Russia, an Italian army that serves on the Eastern Front. And then the rest are basically garrison troops that are garrisoning portions of Greece, the Balkans, and southern France. When Italy leaves the war, these 2 million men essentially, again, leave the Axis order of battle. And the Germans have to make up the difference. Not only do they have to send forces into Italy itself to occupy that country, assuming they don't want the Allies to gain control of Italy, which is what they do. So Italy will essentially become an occupied country by the Germans, just like the rest of Europe is. But they also have to send forces to make up for these garrison troops that the Italians had provided in the Balkans and southern France. And they have to make up for these as well. So this ends up being a substantial diversion of resources that the Germans have to put forth, which by the summer of 1944, the Germans have a total of 53 divisions in southern Europe. This includes about half of those are in Italy itself confronting the Allies, but the other half, again, are in the Balkans and in southern France as garrison troops, again, to a large extent making up the role that the Italians had provided for them. And to put that in perspective, that's almost as many divisions as the Germans had in Northwest Europe at the time, which, of course, is when the Allies have landed in Normandy and are beginning phases of the Northwest Europe campaign. The Germans almost have as many divisions in Southern Europe as they do in Northwest Europe. So this is a major diversion of effort that this forces upon the Germans that, again, a lot of people just kind of tend to ho-hum and don't take note of. But this is, again, one of the strategic consequences of the fall of Italy. Now, to answer your question regarding the naval war, yes, one should reasonably surmise that with the surrender of the Italian fleet, the naval contest is going to be over. That would be a reasonable thing to surmise, but it would also be incorrect because the Germans simply just pick up where the Italians have left off, and the naval contest will continue on. The Germans are able to do this, again, with three major weapons. The Luftwaffe and the submarines, which I said had been there already, and they will continue to operate those. But the third thing is, while it's true that large numbers, 108 Italian warships get away to surrender to the Allies, large numbers of Italian warships don't get away. Now, by and large, these are smaller vessels, destroyers and less. By and large, these are non-operational vessels at the time of the Italian capitulation. Many of these are vessels that have been battle damaged and they're undergoing repairs, or in some cases, you have vessels that are under construction and they haven't been completed yet. So they're not able to get away. The Germans, in their usual efficiency, will roll into these different areas, seize these ports, repair and put into service large numbers of these vessels. And in the end, they'll put in about 36 captured, predominantly Italian destroyers and torpedo boats, along with a handful of Yugoslav and French similar vessels, will be put into German service. And for the last 20 months of the war, the Germans will continue surface operations using these captured Italian and other Allied vessels that they utilize. And to give you an idea, again, the scope of some of the fighting that will occur in the last 20 months of this conflict, during this time, the Allies will lose 39 principal warships in the Mediterranean, and the Germans will lose 111. So there's still a fair amount of naval combat that takes place during this time frame. And that's one of the things I like to delineate my book, compared to, a lot of other books that have been written about this subject, because I've read books about the Mediterranean contest, and, a lot of them will end literally with the end of the North African campaign. And if not then, they'll certainly end, with the surrender of the Italian fleet. But my book covers the entire gambit of this contest, including this period of time when Germany takes over this maritime contest. And certainly it's not on the same scale that it had been when the Italians were there, but this naval contest continues, as demonstrated by those loss figures that I suggested.
They're incredible loss figures. What are they actually doing? Are they selling out to attack the Allied fleet directly, or is the Kriegsmarine selling out to support German operations in and around Greece and the Adriatic?
Both. I mean, again, it comes right down to logistics again. With their successes in North Africa and then subsequent capture of Sicily, by the middle of 1943, the Allies opened up the Mediterranean to Allied merchant traffic. and it becomes a major transportation artery of convoys flowing through the Mediterranean, back and forth, basically via the Atlantic to the Indian Ocean. And of course, one of the beneficiaries of this are the British forces that exist, in Burma and in India. They're finally able to start building up decently and be able to take the offensive. But another beneficiary of this is the Soviet Union, because a lot of these supply ships are providing resources to the Soviets via Persia. They'll go up through Iran. And also then near the end of the Mediterranean conflict, the ships are actually sailing through the Mediterranean going up to the Black Sea. So a beneficiary of the supply traffic are the Russians. So you have this tremendous amount of supply traffic that's passing through there. And the Germans are attempting to interdict this, not so much with their surface warships, but certainly with their aircraft and their submarines. As far as the surface warships are concerned, they're primarily used, for defensive purposes, because the Germans are still also logistically trying to support their own forces along the coastlines of Italy, in the Balkans area, where in many cases you have very rough terrain, and the only legitimate way you can support some of their isolated garrisons is via maritime resupply. And then, of course, in the Aegean, it's the same type of a situation. So, again, it's still very much a contest of logistics. The scales are very much different. I mean, the Allies are moving literally millions of tons of supplies, and the Germans are moving tens of thousands of tons of supplies. But it's the same logistical contest, trying to logistically support your own forces while trying to impede the other guy's ability to logistically support his. Again, most of these German surface forces are used defensively then in this regard to support their logistical operations in those coastal areas. But they will carry out, a mine lane and those type of things. But they're not in a position to seriously challenge the Allies. It's more of just trying to maintain, what they can in these coastal regions.
That's absolutely fascinating. Again, that's sort of, as you say, the end period of the war. That period of the war that nobody really talks about. Everyone's eyes have moved to Normandy, away from the Mediterranean, and I guess the Pacific as well at this point is really coming into its own, and the Mediterranean is just a part of an early part of the war that we've moved on from.
I was going to say, just in conclusion, I think it's fair to say, when you look at the Mediterranean theater as a whole, and I touched upon some of these different benefits that it provides to the Allies, I think it's fair to say that the Mediterranean was a worthwhile fight to have. Without hesitation, I can say that the Allies gained a whole series of benefits by their victories in the Mediterranean, and this absolutely does help bring about the demise of the European Axis, and it supports the Allied war effort. So it is a theater of the war that actually plays important dividends to the overall Allied war effort. And like you say, at different times, it's things that sometimes tend to be overlooked, which I think it's important then, when you are looking at those areas that are being overlooked, to kind of shine the spotlight on them and say, well, let's take a look at this a little bit more, because it does warrant our attention.
Well, I mean, some of the big takeaways I think are fascinating is how massively outnumbered the British were. I'm completely fascinated by the fact that that I just assumed that nothing ever got through to Malta. I just found that the fact that it was constantly supplied, but it is all you ever hear about is that sort of period where nothing gets through and the British sending another convoy and it's just decimated. And you think, oh, they've got one ship through, hurrah, but what losses.
And that's certainly, I mean, that's a real period of the contest, but it's only part of the picture. It
comes back to that slight oddity I think you point out in your other book. When you look at the numbers, the British couldn't lose it. It couldn't lose in the Atlantic. There's just so much shipping. But that's not the story of the war that we're told. So we're just almost living on the propaganda from 1940-45, which has become the truth. The desperation of it all. And it's only sort of all this time later when people start scratching away at the figures, they start questioning what has been up until this point a truth that is, as you say, it's a moment in time that rather than the whole war.
Well, that's one of the things that I enjoy. And when you write comprehensive books like I do, I mean, you cover everything. but I enjoy comparing, like I said, people know about Taranto and they know about the Battle of Matapan. And of course I have, I write about that and I enjoy writing about that. But I really enjoy writing about the things that people are less familiar with because, again, it's like, shining that spotlight on these other areas that also deserve to be viewed. So I cover it all, or at least that's what I set out to do, and provide a comprehensive picture.
Well, I think you do that with this book. I enjoyed it. Thank you, Brian. Loyal listener, if you would like to read Brian's book, it is Blue Water War, The Maritime Struggle in the Mediterranean. As ever, I will put a link on the website. That is all for this episode of the show. I'm not sure what we'll be looking at next time. It could be Dunkirk or it could be the surrender of Japan. I guess we'll wait and see. That's all from me for now. I'm Angus Wallace, and thanks for listening.
Jerry 88mm gun hit our tank, blew us the hell out of it.
Stalingrad can never be repaired.
As Allied Commander-in-Chief, I have granted a military armistice.